this morning, so it was good to do the introduction. But I did not assign myself this position today of speaking to you, but I am glad to be with you, and I'm glad that you're here. And we're going to spend some time together talking about women of the Old Testament and then applying some of these things to ourselves. Also, I have asked Sister Rita Ward, one of our members here, and one of our beloved ladies here at Grand Trail, to lead our prayer. We'll do that first before we get started here. If you cannot hear, I want you to raise your hand, because I hate to be in a class where I cannot see or cannot hear. So immediately we want to correct those things if you cannot hear. Everybody can hear well? We want to welcome you to the Fort Worth Lectures, to the ladies class in particular. I'm particularly thankful this year that we do not have to climb the steep stairways. And I think we would all like to applaud that, but we won't. We regret very much that over the last several years, this is our 10th lectureship at Brown Trail and Fort Worth Lectures, and someone has fallen almost every year. And sometimes it has been serious. So we regret that very much. And this year we just had to make some changes to avoid that. And that's why we're not having, one of the reasons why we're not having the new meals in this room as we usually do, except for one day. And that will be Wednesday. I hope you can be with us. We're going to honor Brother W.B. West, Jr. And he will be our honor to whom honor is due. And if you can possibly be here that day, you need to be here. These are highlights. These men are getting on up in years. They will not be with us probably many, many more years. And so it is a milestone if you can attend those functions. My topic that I was assigned is, how did godly women work to receive God's favor in the Old Testament? Many of us probably are not as interested in studying the Old Testament as we are the New. But we can learn so many valuable lessons from the Old Testament books, and certainly from studying Bible women. Brother Whitten mentioned the Bible women's course that I teach, God's Woman. And in developing those lessons for the wives of preachers to be, they were chosen specifically, the characters that I use in those lessons, for the lessons to be taught that we need to learn. And so, naturally today we will be talking about some of those also. As we get into the lesson, I want to do as Brother Gibson did last night. I want to go over the outline briefly with you. Those of you who have the book, of course, have this material. But I'm just going to bring out the main points of that outline. Our overall theme for the women's studies this week will be godly women working in godly ways. And certainly I know you wouldn't be here if you did not have the desire and the aim and the goal to be a godly woman. And I know of nothing needed in the world today more than godly women. We are such a tremendous influence in this world, and we can be a greater influence. But we do have to put forth a sincere effort to accomplish that. Women have changed so much in the past 20 years. And I think that has a tremendous effect on our world. Some of the other speakers this week will be bringing out some of these things, and we certainly don't want to overlap their area of information. And I want to encourage you right now to be here every day if you possibly can. Arrange your schedule to hear these 4 lectures, because they are certainly coordinated to go together. And we have some wonderful speakers lined up. Tomorrow will be Irene Taylor. And I have not heard her speak. This is Robert Taylor's wife, and Brother Taylor, I guess, has been on our lectureship every year. But I have not heard her speak, but we had her scheduled last year, and she became ill earlier in the year, and so we rescheduled. But I look forward to hearing her tomorrow. And then also on Wednesday, we have Pat Searle from Arlington, and those of you who heard her last year will certainly want to hear her again. And then we have Pat Suba on Thursday, and I know you're looking forward to hearing her again. So we do have a wonderful week lined up, and after all, there aren't many things that we can't postpone for an hour or so in order to grow spiritually and to become stronger Christian women, more godly women. In introducing our topic today of how did women in the Old Testament receive God's favor, the first thing I thought of was that you have to have an attitude of desiring to receive God's favor before you're going to do very much along those lines in your life. And so we're going to talk about that as a background. And then the life and times of Old Testament women, we will talk about some of the history of different periods of the Bible of the Old Testament. And then some examples of Old Testament women who worked at pleasing God and accomplished that. And then applying some of these things to women of today as the conclusion. The introduction of how does one develop these characteristics of receiving God's favor. The first requirement for one to please God is a strong desire to do that. The Lord tells us that the first thing we must do is deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow Him, and to be a Christian. And the same thing was true of these women of old. The first thing they had to do was have a desire to please God. And that does not come without effort. Another quality is that of self-sacrifice and humble surrender. A person does not become a Christian, a real Christian, a true Christian, without surrendering that individual will to God's will and be willing to do that. And that's the hardest part, I think, of being a Christian, is surrendering my will in all kinds of life circumstances to the will of God. And it does take a lot of effort and a lot of prayer, a lot of study. The word handmaid is applied many times in the Old Testament and some in the New Testament. It's used many times in the Bible, and it signifies a bondmaid, or one who gives up self to the will of another. And I think we as women have a hard time with that. And yet, don't we have to learn that submission in marriage? First, we have to learn it in the home that we grow up in. We have to surrender our will to siblings in the home, or to parents, or to grandparents, or whatever. We have to learn submission of our will to the will of another. And many times, Bible women are referred to as handmaids or bondmaids. Well, whether that's an attractive thought or not, we're going to build on that a little later. But when one chooses to obey God and to make a life that is one of service to Him, then the course of that life is more or less set for that life to be brought into the will of God. That's a very important thought that I want you to really get clearly in your mind. That first of all, there has to be that desire to serve God and to have my will in submission to Him. And these women that we're going to be talking about today had to also learn these same lessons that we're still learning. Certain attitudes have to be present to be developed in one who would be pleasing to God. Many have developed proper attitudes regarding this desire only after catastrophic experiences in their own lives. It was not a choice made many years ago. It may have been after many, many mistakes in our lives that we make. We realize that we should have made a better choice. But it is hopeful, and certainly these classes that are designed to strengthen us and to help us in our daily lives, it's hoped that we might avoid those mistakes in our lives and those tragedies and catastrophes that sometimes finally will bring us to our knees before God. How much more pleasant and how much wiser it is if we can make that choice and those choices in and of ourselves to serve God and to live a godly life as a woman. In this study, we will be endeavoring to identify the kind of person, particularly women we're talking about, who illustrate how to achieve the state of being approved of God. First of all, we want to talk about a little history, the life and times of Bible women. There are some books out on this topic, and just life and times of the Bible that are very interesting. We have some of those in our library, and I'm sure that you have read some of those. The more we understand about the background of Old Testament women or New Testament women, the more we appreciate and can learn from their experiences and their lives. We all know, most of us who are in the church are familiar with Bible history, and we know that there were three great dispensations covered in the Old Testament, particularly the patriarchal, the Mosaic, and then we come down to the Christian age. The patriarchal age is that period in which, of course, God dealt with heads of families directly. And the women had a different role, and a particular role to play back then that was one more or less silent. And yet they had a very important role, just as we do today. We don't hear a lot about what they said or wrote or taught, but we know they were there and we can see the influences of their lives, and we're going to talk about some of those. In this period we meet Abraham. When we meet Abraham, we meet Sarah. Isaac, their son, and his wife Rebecca. And really, Old Testament history is centered around these Bible characters. Isn't that how we learn Old Testament history? By the characters of each period? And then there was Jacob and his wife that we have studied so much about, Rachel and Leah. And then there was Joseph and his wonderful moral character that we studied about. Then the Mosaic period, where we see the courageous Jochebed, the mother of Moses. And then her other children, Aaron and her daughter Miriam. And we see the experiences that they had, and we can learn a lot of things from that. The patriarchal age, of course, began the development of the nation of Israel. And while we're not going in depth into these historical points, I'm just touching on these to refresh your memory and to make us see where we're coming from today. God told Abraham and Sarah to leave their family, leave their possessions, and go into a far country. They were to be the seed that would eventually, through their seed, bring the Messiah. But they didn't know that at that time, what part they would play, but they believed God, and they did according to what He asked them to do. Their faith, their travels, their God-directed lives show us what life was like during this period if we really observe these things as we study these Bible characters. So it's an understatement to say that back then, in this early period of Bible history, these women could be pleasing to God if they obeyed Him and if they heard His word and acted upon it. So the same thing is true today. We can be approved of God if we do these same things. The primary and future rewards of obedience we clearly learn from Old Testament history. God clearly shows us through the development of these characters in the Old Testament what His Word said, by how He spoke to them, whether they obeyed or disobeyed, what the consequences were of obedience or disobedience. And the New Testament tells us that the law that He gave to His people, the nation of Israel, was the schoolmaster to bring men to the new law. And so we can learn many things from this great period of time. In the Mosaic period, of course, then we think about Moses, and we think about Jochebed, and I could just imagine, and you can too, how she felt, putting this precious, innocent baby into a basket that she hoped she had sealed properly, into the water, and letting go. And it still gives me goosebumps to think about it. But this mother had a great faith in God. And we as mothers need to have a deep and abiding faith in God. That's the only way that we can do the things that Jochebed, such as what she did. And of course, we're not called upon to put our baby into the stream and let go. But we have just as many serious challenges with regard to mothering today. And although we have different challenges. But we see this woman, Jochebed, we see her children, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, as they led Israel during the captivity. And as they wandered toward Canaan and they made mistakes in judgment, they made mistakes with respect to honoring authority that God had chosen. We've seen many of the things that they did in their lives that were mistakes. But we also see their great and tremendous faith that it took to follow God's word and to be obedient. The development of a nation was carried out through this period of wandering. Again, God's requirements and His discipline brought about those who were pleasing to Him, but only through obedience to what He has instructed them to do. We too have our wilderness wandering, and it's this life that we're in right now. We're wandering just as surely as those Jews wandered toward Canaan, but our Canaan is that heavenly home which we're seeking. But with His discipline and His purification in our lives daily, we can do as they did. We can be pleasing to God. And we can enter that Canaan, that heaven that we're all interested in today. Now let's look at some of these Old Testament women and see what we can learn from them. And I love to study their lives, and I know you do too. But every time that I study their lives and read the Word of God concerning them, I learn something that I hadn't noticed before. And so maybe we'll be able to do that today. The first woman, Eve, had the perfect husband, the perfect place to live, perfect environment, we might say, and she was brought into existence to enhance or perfect God's other creation. We've studied these lessons so many times, and yet we need to study them quite often. We're told in Genesis 2:18 that God said, "It is not good for man to be alone." And so He made a woman, and He says, "I will make a helper suitable for him, or a help meet for him." And so in God's wisdom, He made us. And I think more highly of myself when I think of these words, and I need to be reminded of them from time to time. There are times when we all begin to feel like servants in our household, I'm sure, quite often. And, we read many articles about how a lot of women feel unfulfilled and how they have a lot of emotional problems because of these things. But when I think that God had made all the wonders of creation, and He saw that it was not good until He made us, and then He said it is good. So that should make us feel a lot better toward ourselves and toward our girls that we bring into this life. We need to teach them these things, that God made you for a special purpose, and you are special. Eve was beguiled, of course. The Bible tells us in 1 Timothy 2:14 that she was beguiled and fell into transgression. Of course, we read that account in Genesis. But verse 15 tells us she shall be saved through childbearing. Now, if I ask for a show of hands to explain that, I don't think I'd probably see very many hands. But I believe God when He said, "She shall be saved through childbearing." And what a blessing it is for those of us who are able to bear children. And some are not. And certainly I know that makes an implication on the application of this verse. That God did not, He would not base our salvation on something we were not able to accomplish. So think about that when you're studying the meaning of "she shall be saved through childbearing." Although not much is said in the Genesis account of Eve after the fall, have you ever thought about that? How little is said of Eve after the fall? Just bits and pieces, but we can glean some lessons from what is said. Of course, the Bible was written as an account, and especially in Genesis, an account of the fall of man. It really wasn't meant to be a detailed account of the creation, or we would have a lot more information that we would really like to have. But it's an account of how man fell and how man was restored into a relationship with God. So when we study it from that aspect, we'll understand things a lot better. We won't have all the answers we'd like to have, but we'll understand why it was written that way. But when we look into this account of Eve after the fall and after God took them out of the garden, we do learn that she named her son Cain, and that she said, I have gotten a man from Jehovah. So she gave God the credit and named her son because of how she felt about God. She bore a third son and called his name Seth. Of course, we know her other son was Abel. And she said, for God hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel. And this was after Cain had slain Abel, Genesis 4:25. But as Eve faced the problems of birth and life and death, we see Eve and her husband were the first to taste the joys of living and to grapple with the profound problems of life and death which engulf all of us. When you think about her home, and you think about her sons, and you think about one son slaying another, don't we pick up our newspapers today and read some of those very same things? God forbid that it happened to us, but it could. And certainly that is a part of life, that we have these experiences, these tragedies many times. But when Eve's grandson Enos was born to Seth, the Bible tells us in Genesis 4:26, then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Now, there are various explanations for what that verse means, too. Some say it means that they began to blaspheme and to say evil, speak evil against God's name. Others say it was the opposite, that men began to see that they had to look to God for guidance. We can only deduct, though, from Eve's attitude in these few little glimpses we get into her after her fall in the garden, that her attitude toward God in these accounts, that she had developed a personal closeness with God, and that she looked to him for his approval after that time. Eve made that fatal mistake that women always, and men too, will have to pay. But we can see through her relationship with her children and the fact that she named them because of God's influence in her life, that she had that personal closeness with him, and that she repented for those things she had done that were evil, and that she was able to be saved in the last days. Noah's wife doesn't have a name in the Bible. We aren't given her name. But you know, we really don't need it. She provides such a noble example of faith and courage and conviction and respect for her husband, and a mother that was able to see her whole family saved. And what more could we ask than that? But Noah's wife had that. And the Bible says that Noah went in, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him into the ark because of the waters of the flood. Genesis 7:7. This family pleased God because they were righteous, the Bible tells us. Genesis 6:9 says, Noah was a just man and perfect in his generation. And wouldn't you like to have that said of your husband? And Noah's wife had that said of her husband, and I know she must have had a great deal to do with that. And then in chapter 7, verse 1, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation, when everyone around them was wicked and perverse, and probably somewhat of what we see in the world today, only more so. We see this family who were righteous before God, and God speaks these things of them. I have seen him righteous before me in this generation. Again, showing the personal notation that God makes of our lives. Righteousness has to do with right living. When you see that word in the Bible, always think about that. It has to do with right living, whether it's my relationship with my fellow man, my family, or with God. Right living. Or God's just dealings with man. God is always fair. He's always just. And that's one of the reasons we need to leave a lot of things in his hands and not try to handle it ourselves. So righteousness then is something that we should seek. The child of God who receives approval in his sight must seek to be righteous, as was Noah and his wife and family. Now we're going to look at Sarah, who is one of our favorite Old Testament characters. Number one, she was beautiful. We all would like to be beautiful. And hopefully we're beautiful inside if we can't be beautiful outside. And God has given us that capability. Sarah has already been mentioned, of course, as being part of the patriarchal period. The fact that her life was one of adventure. And I certainly have a lot of respect for Sarah. If someone came and told my husband, and I'm not even sure what my attitude would be if I knew God told him to get up and move and leave all his possessions and his family and go into a country that I knew not, I would have to think about that a while. But Sarah went, and evidently with a good spirit, she went. And so I have a lot of admiration for her. Her life was one of adventure, one of great faith and wealth. They did accumulate much wealth, of course, in the country to which they went. She also knew fear and challenge and endurance. She reveals beauty, intelligence, and yet a respectful nature for her husband that we could all learn. And I'm certainly referring to myself when I say this. We need to learn that respect for our husband. And Sarah called Abraham Lord. And so we need to have that kind of respect for our husband. And develop it, work on it, pray about it, and develop respect for your husband. And your children are going to have the same type of respect for their father that you have for your husband. So we have to work at that, and some of us have a stronger will than others. I think some women are very gracious and glad to let the husband just have all the authority in the home and everything, and some of the rest of us have a little more trouble with that. So we have to work at it a little harder. But it was a challenge, to say the least, to live the life that Sarah lived. Sarah was chosen to bear Isaac when she was past age. That was quite a challenge right there, was it not? At her age, to bear a son. But through faith, also, Sarah herself received strength. And of course, this came from God, and that's where our strength comes from. When she was past age to bear this child. Through faith, she received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age. Now why? Because she judged him faithful who had promised. Hebrews 11:11. Sarah was not perfect, but she was godly. She was a God-fearing woman and one who showed respect for her husband. And then I have this quote, she never ran away from difficult situations or allowed her feet to stumble along the way. With fortitude and courage, she faced whatever came, and so lives on as the esteemed wife of the first patriarch of the ancient Hebrews, who honor her to this day. Edith Dean makes that statement in her book, Wisdom from Women in the Bible. She's mentioned in that great gallery of portraits that are drawn for us from the 11th chapter of Hebrews. Truly believing God by that kind of faith will result in God's approval of our life. The faith that Sarah had is one that we can really study and learn from. And then there was Rebecca in Genesis, the 24th chapter, who was chosen actually by God, as we saw his providence unfold there, with the aged servant Eliezer being sent by Abraham to find a wife for his son Isaac among his own people. And we could talk about the lessons there. He prayed for divine guidance in meeting this charge given him by Abraham. And he went out to find this wife, and you remember the story of Rebecca. This is one of the lessons that I do teach in the PTS Wives class. Rebecca is one of the ones we study. And she was such a pleasant person when we were introduced to her. She was a young maid, and she ran out, remember, to get water from the camels, and she offered just everything. And as I say in the manuscript, she did more than she had to do. This is a good quality to have. And I find this varies greatly from one person to another. Are you willing to do more than you have to do? And I think that would probably make a good lesson. I just now thought of it. Do you do more than you have to do for your family? Do you do more than you have to do for the Lord? Do you do more than you have to do for your neighbors? So you see, we could talk about that for a long time. We all appreciate it when we come in contact with someone like that who does that for us. But let's look and see if we're that kind of person. She did more than she had to do. We see these qualities in her life. Fair to look upon, a virgin, courteous, helpful, industrious, hospitable, and generous, courageous, adventurous, modest, and chaste. Remember when she saw her husband-to-be that she covered her face, and as the custom was then, showing her chastity and her modesty, and how hard those qualities are getting to be to find. But we in this room all have younger women in our circle of family and friends that we can influence along these lines. These are such wonderful qualities, and what more could one want in a wife? If young men who are seeking a wife would look at Rebecca and look at these qualities and look for them in a mate, they would certainly do well if they could find them. Young women could learn much from these qualities in the life of Rebecca. She too was used in God's providence because of her character that was suitable for His use. And we'll talk more about that a little later. Esther is one of two books of the Bible named for women, Esther and Ruth, of course. The beautiful star, as her name literally means, truly shone as womanhood at its most noble. Another woman who's spoken of as beautiful, and the king fell in love with her immediately. You remember when he was seeking through all these young maidens for a wife to take the place of Vashti, and he had vanished. So you're all familiar, I'm sure, with the book of Esther, but study it again for the qualities you can glean there to apply to your own life. As a young Jewish maid who was chosen as a Persian queen, she had a storybook life in a way. Of course, she was in captivity, and that wasn't such a storybook matter. But as a young Jewish maid, she was chosen as a Persian queen and thrust into this situation. And the way she handled it, we can learn so much from that. She was never haughty or proud because of the position that she got. And we can just learn so many things along those lines in character of Esther from the book of Esther. She demonstrates the best qualities any woman could have: chastity, humility, faith, courage. She was quite courageous. Kindness and respect for her husband again. We'll keep running into that. As well as her uncle Mordecai, who was really not her parent, but had brought her up and had influenced her greatly and very carefully planned her destiny. And she was most fortunate to have had an uncle like Mordecai. And the quote then of this famous verse from the book of Esther, "And who knoweth whether thou art not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" The women in my ladies' classes have heard me mention this so many times that I'm sure it becomes trite. But who knows but what you today are in the kingdom of God today to be used in some special way. There may be times in the kingdom today, and I think I've seen some of these times in the church, when we are an Esther, quote, could speak up for the defense of the truth or the purity of the gospel and be doing the same type of thing that Esther did in her time. Courage and spiritual strength of a life fully dependent on God is one which will receive His approval, again, as we see illustrated in the life of Esther. She's one of our favorites of the Old Testament. Hannah is another favorite, and one from which we can learn so much about devotion to God. Truly, that was the center of her life, her devotion to God. Remember her prayers, the pain and the aches in her heart as she prayed for a child. And of course, again, Jochebed, two Old Testament examples of mothers who gave their sons completely into God's service and were willing to do that. Now, that's a very unselfish thing for women to do. And I don't know how many of us would be willing to do that. We see as we study their lives that the character of these two men that they were blessed with, Samuel and Moses, brought the greatest rewards to these mothers, if indeed they lived to see the end result of those lives. We don't have a lot about the lives of these women after those children were born, but we know something of their character. But we need courageous mothers today, such as these two examples, who will see that their children are devoted to God and to His service. And it takes courage. You have to be courageous, I believe, to rear children. Don't you think so? I guess we could say amen in here. There's no men around. But really and truly, I think it takes so much courage not only to bear a child and to bring it into this world, a lot of courage, but to rear that child to be one who's devoted to God's service. Edith Dean states concerning the home and mothers like these that I'm talking about with these two examples, the early Hebrew home was regarded as the temple of the woman. When she created an atmosphere of righteousness, and members of her family were taught to love God with all their hearts, each knew the value of keeping His covenant with God. Remember they were taught, remember Deuteronomy 6, write it on the doorposts, write it everywhere, teach it when they rise up, teach it when they go to bed. All these things, the value of keeping their covenant with God, but they had to be taught. They didn't just naturally do this, their children. In the tradition of this national legacy, Hebrew women discerned better the power of God over all His people. It is no wonder then that the God-loving people, God-loving woman of Israel, from patriarchal times, loved their faith and nurtured their children. Do we do that today? Do we love our faith? Is it strong and is it alive? And do our children know that and see that in our lives? We must. We could study a host of other Old Testament women who received God's approval. There was Ruth, the lovable daughter-in-law who chose the God of her mother-in-law. And that's a beautiful story. We see so many good qualities there we could talk about. But we can't go into detail, of course, in all of these. Naomi was another who had great courage. There was Deborah, whom God raised up to judge Israel. Have you studied Deborah? Do you know all the answers to the questions there that it brings to your mind? Why did God choose a woman to judge Israel? The Bible calls her a mother of Israel. And she sat under a tree and she judged Israel. My theory is that evidently there was no man willing to be used at this time by God to accomplish His purpose of delivering Israel. You remember how the attitudes of some of the men that are mentioned there, I'll only go if you go, you know. And so maybe there was no man, and God saw there's no man willing to do this. So I'll have to have a woman to get this man to go do what his duty is. Have you ever heard of that? Do we have that in the church today? Yes, we do. If it weren't for women, and I believe this, if it weren't for women, I think the church would have perished long centuries ago. God may strike me dead for that. But I remember a lesson that Brother Wendell Winkler taught one time that impressed me so much, and some of you from Brother Trails are here today, and I do want to commend my ladies class for being here today when they hear me all the time. The fact that Brother Winkler brought this lesson, and it was from 1st or 2nd Kings, and it was about a woman that had a great spiritual influence, and he made that point that many places in the world today, the church would not have survived if faithful women had not seen that services were conducted. And you've known places like that. The women cannot take that role that God didn't give us to do the preaching and the public teaching and that type of thing. But if it were not for women working behind the scenes with courage and faith and devotion to God, the church in that place would probably not be meeting today. And many times it has come around and done full circle, and people have moved in there, and men have taken the lead in and gone right on. But Brother Winkler pointed that out, and I appreciate that. The worthy woman, but I want to mention this one thing about Naomi and Deborah and Ruth, just as we touch on their lives, that God used a woman to accomplish His will when men were unwilling to. And He did put her with a man. I want to point that out. He did put her with a man to do this job. And that was God's will, and that is God's will. And I certainly do appreciate that. I appreciate men taking the lead. I think they're wonderful at it. We're not equipped for that. And those things I do appreciate God's wisdom in. But God could use them, these women we're talking about, in His plan. Why? Because they were of the character and the heart to be used by Him. The worthy woman of Proverbs 31, and we've been studying her again this year from a little different viewpoint. Family-oriented, unselfish, fulfilling life can well be used as a text for young women to follow today. She's still very appropriate for us to study today. And then I have this that I want our younger women especially to get today. Let young mothers train their daughters to hold these high ideals, like these Old Testament women we've been talking about, as sacred principles to follow. We must teach our daughters these things. Excellent domestic accomplishments such as sewing, cooking, rearing children, and being a career homemaker, if you want to call her that. A wife and mother, a grandmother, should be taught to our daughters today and stress these as wonderful accomplishments in life. I know that I couldn't be as proud of anything my daughter would do as a career as I am of her as a career mother. And we need to stress those lessons to our children. I'm not as concerned about what she might do as a career in the world, although I would be proud of her in any honest endeavor. But I want her to know I'm proud of her as being a career homemaker, wife, and mother. God-approved lives are the result of sacrificial service to God. We must learn to sacrifice our will to His as these women did. What about God's women today? And I'm not spending a lot of time on this because I know some of the other women have that in their topics. Recently, here at Brown Trail, in the past year, Sister Rita Ward, who led our prayer this morning, studied with us, or shared with us some of her studies, the lives of Restoration history women. Now, we've always heard about the men in the Restoration movement, and she began to study some of those things, and she began to notice the wives in the background. And she began to write down things and to save little clippings and this type of thing. And she taught 2 or 3 classes using that material. Very interesting. Most of the time, these women carried on at home while their husbands went about preaching. And we can see some Sarahs and some of the travels that were necessary in this type of thing. Sometimes they endured hardships, waiting for months or weeks for his return. And sometimes he returned to learn that a child had died, and she wasn't even able to get in touch with him. And certainly he couldn't have gotten back in time to bury the child. Sometimes the homestead had burned to the ground, and there was nothing for him to come home to. Many of those tragedies really that happened back in those early years in the 1800s in our country. These women had strong faith that made it possible for them to endure, all for the great cause of the truth being preached. Are we that unselfish? So the truth can be preached. We will carry on at home for that man that's out preaching the truth and not complain too much. They had no more ability and probably not as much due to lack of opportunity than we do today. But they did these things. But their hearts were aflame with conviction for the work that was bigger than they were and more important than they were of their safety and comforts at home. Aren't we thankful for the Alexander Campbells, the Barton Stones, and the Raccoon John Smith that helped restore the New Testament pattern in America? The statement was made that those women were not inspired. Rita made this statement. She said, these women weren't inspired. And these Bible women we've been studying today were not inspired of God to do these good things and to live courageously and with conviction. But the account of them is inspired, of course. The recording of that is certainly inspired. But these women were like we are. They were women created in the image of God. But they were women just as we are today, with courage, honor, and devotion to God, and a willingness to do whatever it took to be a good wife, mother, teacher, servant of God. And that's what's required to receive God's approval, as did these. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is my God. The God of Sarah, Rebekah, and Rachel is your God and my God. The same God that we read about in the Old Testament. He feels the same. He is the same forever. Access to Him is available at all times through our prayers. And the lesson yesterday about prayer and how we need to avail ourselves of more of that. We'd be better mothers if we would pray for our children more. And sometimes as I was rearing my children, I found that that was the only thing I could do at a certain point was pray. After they reach a certain age and they're out and gone, and you think, I don't have control, I don't know where they are, and I don't know what they're doing, but I trust in God and I pray for His help for them. As He heard Hannah's prayer, He hears my prayer and yours. Bible women were written out as examples for women today, tomorrow. His word is our complete guide in every good work. Let us think on the words of 1 Peter 3:3-5, which we could well read daily and learn from. Whose adorning, let it not be the outward adorning of the braiding the hair, the wearing of jewels of gold, or putting on of apparel. But let it be the hidden man or woman, in this case, of the heart, in the incorruptible apparel of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. For after this manner aforetime, we've talked about today, holy women also, who hoped in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye now are, if you do well and are not put in fear of any terror. What a wonderful verse for us to memorize, for us to think upon, to meditate upon, and to ask God's help to be one of Sarah's daughters. How can we be one of Sarah's daughters? The Bible says, if you do well. Now that's simple, isn't it? If you do well. But what's involved in that? If you seek higher things in your life rather than the material. Now that's hard. That's not simple. But we can do it with God's help. If you stress the spiritual in your life rather than the material. If you have time to teach a class and teach it well, rather than spending all your valuable time in other activities, in activities of the world. If you respect your husband and you're an honor to him. If you refuse to dress in garments that holy women of God would not wear. If you care more for others than for self, and share what you have, whether it's little or much, with those who are less fortunate, and those are always available if we're willing to do that, as did Dorcas, a New Testament example. These things are still required of women today, as we read in 1 Peter 3:3-5, just as it was in the early days in the Old Testament of God's people. The latter part of 1 Peter 3:5 is an interesting section there in that verse, and are not put in fear of any terror. Do we have anything to fear as we read our newspapers or watch the news on TV today? I mean, really, at one point in her life, my daughter said, I no longer watch the news because it's just all bad. And she said, I just don't watch it, which may be a good solution, I don't know. But this verse, the meaning of this verse is interesting. The statement evidently referred to the persecution of the time that it was written in 1 Peter. Time of persecution for Christians, but special efforts would be made to frighten the wise to give up their profession of faith. Menaces of evil may assail the Christian life, but let her be calm and confident, and let her pursue the path of obedience to the will of God. And the holy courage of Sarah will sustain her amid whatever terrors may arise. And certainly that's something good for us to think about, that the conviction, faith, and the trust in God, and dependence on Him will sustain us through any terror. And, when the emergency comes, it's too late to worry about it, isn't it? And let us depend upon God to sustain us, whatever comes. If the communists take our country, would we be strong enough to be sustained by our faith in God and continue to believe in Him and to live for Him as much as was possible, openly? Women today need this confidence, this calm and confidence that God will provide, as terrors of worldly nature would hinder her service and her commitment to God. And I think we have some women in the church who let these terrors hinder them in their service to God. Threat of persecution could be allowed to weaken our lives and service. And I can see women whose husbands are not Christians that bear persecutions that many of us who have Christian husbands don't understand really and don't fully appreciate. But those women, this is a terror in a way of a worldly nature that might hinder her service, but don't let it hinder your service. Put God first in your life. Pressure groups such as the Women's Liberation Group can cause godly women to back off and retreat if the eye is not stayed on Him who is able to keep us from all harm and to overcome every evil. Sarah's daughters do not shrink back from using every ounce of influence for good at every opportunity. And we need to keep very alert about opportunity. I want to read this in closing. It's a quote from Wisdom from the Women of the Bible. Because of our changing needs, few parents today can be as dedicated as Jochebed or as the little-known mother who inspired this poem called The Watcher. She always learned to watch for us, anxious as if we were late, in winter by the window, in summer by the gate. And though we mocked her tenderly, who had such foolish care, the long way home would seem more safe because she waited there. Her thoughts were also full of us. She never could forget, and so I think that where she is, she must be watching you, waiting till we come home to her, anxious if we're late, watching from heaven's window, leaning from heaven's gate. With parents like the Watcher, few children grow to be problem adults. They will have problems, that is certain, but they will meet them with more confidence and faith. Tomorrow's woman, if she is wise and would please God, will follow the same instruction book, the Bible, as those we have discussed. She must meet new challenges. Our age of technology brings us new challenges, but we meet them in the same way as our examples today. Her strength and her inspiration must be the same as He who strengthened and inspired women since the beginning. And our conclusion, life is a series of choices, and we make those choices in our lives. Some of the choices Bible women made have been noted in this study. Some women chose early in life to put God first in their lives, and they found that no sacrifice was too great. The things of this life matter less each day, and that treasures laid up in heaven make it all worthwhile. The Lord desires such to serve Him in the home, in the church, and in the world as others' lives have to be touched by ours. May God help us to be approved in His sight in the last day. Thank you. Open on